welcome to another episode of Give Me an Answer. It's great to have you with us this morning. We have the Oxford professor. He used to teach at Oxford about 12, 13 years ago, Peter Atkins. He has written, prolific writer and author, many, many different books. He was a great chemist, and many of you have probably seen him debating John Lennox and others on YouTube. His two latest books that you guys could certainly check out. We want to know, obviously, both sides, the Christian perspective as well as the agnostic but atheistic perspective on things as well. Conjuring the Universe is a great one he's written, so check that out. We'll have the links below. You can see it after this video. And then two, On Being, a scientist explains the great questions of being. So see those links, and we are going to have a hard-hitting conversation, maybe with a few even debate elements if proportionate. So thank you, Peter, for coming on.
Pleasure.
All right, do we have his audio? He's not. Peter, I think you're on mute.
No.
All right, bear with us 1 second here.
No.
Testing. Yeah, now he should be off.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Huh.
We're having a little bit of trouble here.
So we're gonna have to start over again, right?
No, we're
live.
So,
All right.
All right, give us 1 second here.
We still can't hear you, Peter.
Yeah, Peter, we were able to hear you a minute ago.
1, 2, 3, 4.
He's a nut now.
1, 2, 3, 4.
It's still on.
No, it's not on our end. We have our speakers on. Oh, Marie says we can hear him. So maybe we just can't hear him, Tom.
we're having a disconnect problem here on our end.
Marie and company, can you hear us as well?
Yeah, that's the problem. Let's see what we got here.
You can hear Peter.
How was that? Is it back up?
Why don't you speak to us, Peter?
Yeah. I'm still here.
Peter, can you hear us?
All right, bear with us 1 second here. Testing.
Can you hear us, Peter?
I can hear you.
Oh, good. Now we hear you, sir. Yeah.
All right.
We're fine now.
So, okay, let's start us off with the first question here for Peter.
All right, Professor Atkins. I am convinced that a rock, a tree, has no ability to understand the difference between right and wrong, between good and evil. I'm convinced it requires a rational mind to define right, to understand wrong. If there is no mind prior to the human mind, then obviously it's the human mind that creates good and evil, which means that morality is totally relative. But my experience of life and my observation of other people is that there are objective morals, meaning by that, there are certain things that are right and other things that are wrong for all people at all times in all places. Therefore, I am convinced that in order for an atheist to be intellectually consistent, they need to be a moral relativist. There are no moral absolutes because there is no mind prior to the human mind to create and define justice, goodness, kindness. How do you respond to that type of thinking?
Well, broadly by agreeing with you entirely. I mean, the reason why a stone and a tree don't have moral views is that they're very simple entities, whereas we, who do have moral views, are very complex entities, and that our brains have evolved over the millennia to the point that we can consider the consequences of our actions. And I think that morality is a property that has emerged in societies as people have discovered how to behave in order to have a decent life. That we have to find an understanding of what is right and wrong. We have really to look back over our evolutionary history and our ecological history, the way that we have explored ways of behaving, some of which have led literally to dead ends, and others of which have led to flourishing societies. we more or less have a flourishing society with some impediments here and there. Not everyone knows the difference between good and evil. I think if you looked at a jihadist who goes out to murder in the name of Allah, he thinks that he is doing good, whereas we Christians and pseudo-Christians and atheists and agnostics would consider that to be evil. So, some people reinterpret good and evil to suit their agenda.
But is it not sheer pomposity on my part if I, as a white Westerner, declare that the jihadist is wrong? Is that not a type of cultural elitism that is inappropriate?
Yeah. Well, cultural elitism might be appropriate in some instances. I mean, if you take as a general view that one should not harm the aspirations of others, then I think a jihadist who goes out killing people is actually harming their aspirations because they can no longer function. Whereas we, rather perhaps arrogantly, think that our mode of behaving, which is a kind of liberal democracy, just gives a lot of freedom to people and doesn't, on the whole, intrude upon their aspirations. So if you agree that not harming another person's aspirations is good in some sense, then ours is a better society.
But perhaps when it comes to certain societies, obviously in Africa, certain countries within Africa, you have different definitions of the good. So honor killings are better for the community, or you have genital mutilation of females. That's considered better for the community. And it makes me think of this Western liberal secularist female in the Boston Globe. And she traveled to Africa and went to one of these villages. And she tried to take her kind of white Western elitist approach and saying, well, this is not the good for everybody. Let me define it. And she thought she was fighting for social justice, humanistic rights and wrongs. But she went back disillusioned here to the States because she realized their definition of the right and wrong was different in terms of how humans flourish. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think there's a place for cultural relativism and a place where it should not apply. If you take the view, the principal view, which I mentioned a moment ago, that you should not intrude upon the aspirations of others, then I think all the mutilations and honor killings that you've mentioned were despicable. And they're despicable on an absolute value basis. And to come away disillusioned is fine, because you come away disillusioned because the tribe or whatever it is will not accept the imposition of your, as it were, Western attitude. That is the source of disillusion. It's disappointment that you can't get your view across.
But isn't morality based on science really reduced to survival of the fittest? And doesn't that mean then that morality comes out of the barrel of a gun? Whoever has the power, their definition of morality wins. And there is no way that I can appeal to an ultimate objective value of justice and tell people who are very powerful and who have lots of guns that they're wrong.
I think there are two roots of morality. One is our evolutionary history, when we have been conditioned and have developed ways of behaving which lead to the survival of societies and individuals. And allied, on top of that, is the fact that we humans have got big enough brains that in moments of quiet reflection, we can consider the consequences of our actions. I'm not saying that you can always consider the consequence of your action, because in the heat of the moment, quiet contemplation doesn't take place. So, one behaves absurdly and improperly. But I think on the whole, it's that combination of ethological history and the ability to reflect upon the consequences of actions that is the foundation of morality.
I mean, I think about the sociologist Christian Smith at Notre Dame. He's written about high morality versus moderate reality. And I think he's referencing how certainly moral relativists can be good, but oftentimes it's for selfish reasons. It's just like religious people struggle with tribalism when it comes to our own ethics and protecting our own. I think it becomes problematic because I disagree with Steven Pinker, for example. I disagree with Bill Gates, for example. I think parts of the world are getting better. Yes, we are doing a good job in terms of fighting against world poverty. But the issue becomes in the areas that we are not doing well in. And I think we truly, from an existentialist, nihilistic perspective, we have a bleak future ahead of us. Maybe it's thousands of years from now, we don't necessarily know. But the moderate morality, certainly a moral relativist can have. They can certainly take care of their own, love their own tribe. But the high morality becomes problematic because who's to say that I should go with the Red Cross across the globe to help people who have nothing to do with me and my own betterment? How would you respond to that?
Well, as the world emerges and evolves, it is, I believe, getting better. And I think one should do all one can to show that Western values and maybe some Eastern values are the way forward to an improved world. And I think, as you say, as you imply at least, that poverty lies at the root of much evil, but evil doesn't always arise from poverty. Take Nazi Germany, for example, which was an evil empire, but the Nazis weren't poor. They preyed on the poorness of people that were themselves evil. I think one should do all one can to alleviate poverty, to enhance education, and perhaps most important of all, to spread medicine and health through the world, and just hope that in due course, provided the population doesn't explode so much or climate change damage our chances, that given time and patience, the world gets even safer than it is now.
Wouldn't you agree with knowledge? For instance, knowledge is based on the repeatability of an experiment. Historical knowledge has nothing to do with repeatability. It has to do with the trustworthiness of eyewitness testimony. And then there's personal knowledge, trusting a person and building a relationship. So if all of reality is reduced to matter and energy, how on earth can we come up with spirituality, with moral, objective morals that are strong enough for you to call Nazi Germany evil? I mean, certainly if there is no God, there's nothing wrong with eugenics. If there is no God and morality is relative, if someone chooses to participate in eugenics, that's their choice.
Not necessarily, because
I'm not saying that someone's evil.
Well, because if you mutilate people, you are intruding upon their aspirations, and I've proposed that is the foundation of morality, of liberal morality, if you like, that one should not intrude on the aspirations of others. Now, you have to be careful with that, because go back to the Nazis. Hitler had aspirations to eliminate the Jews. I think that is an aspiration worth stamping out. So to thwart his aspiration in that respect would be right, because it would be the lesser of the two evils. So there is judgment. There has to be judgment.
What makes you right and Hitler wrong?
Say that again.
What makes you right and Adolf Hitler wrong?
Because he was thwarting the aspirations of 6 million people. And I think to thwart the aspiration of one person, namely Hitler, is better than thwarting the aspirations of 6 million.
Well, that's great. But if we simply come from goo to the zoo to you, why are you more correct than anybody else?
Well, I'm not claiming that, but I'm saying this is my stance, and this is what I'm basing my morality on. And I'm able to reflect upon it through the emergence, through the generations, of a brain that can consider opportunities, alternatives, and ways forward.
So when we talk about so Cheslov, the philosopher, said that we have evolved from monkeys, apes, therefore let us love one another. So we've been raised red in tooth and claw. You're saying we've simply evolved and come to a higher sense of understanding morality. I mean, what's the basis? So let's just we don't have to take the extremes of Hitler and evil. I mean, what would you simply say to a playground bully who's being mean? What's the motive to not be mean in that scenario? It's all selfish, isn't it? Ultimately, just to better myself. You know, you think about studies right now, 75% of students say that they would cheat on the SAT over here in the US if they could get away with it. I don't see anything wrong with that if I could get away with it.
Yeah, I mean, these are terribly difficult questions, I think. I mean, I'm not looking for a molecular basis of morality, but I'm trying to understand it in the context of the emergence of the human race. I think it's far better to seek an understanding of the roots of behavior than to appeal to written authority. I think appealing, for example, to the Bible or the Quran or whatever, the Book of Mormon, is an inappropriate way of arriving at understanding. In a sense, those books, apart from the Book of Mormon, which of course is just well, I better not say what I think it is, but the Bible really is a collection of anecdotes which are a compilation of ways that distant tribes have struggled with the prospect of getting through life. And to import that into our daily affairs is intrinsically inappropriate, although sometimes it might be helpful because it, like the tarot cards. The tarot cards are a fantasy, but they make you think, and maybe reading the Bible occasionally makes you think about what an appropriate course of action might be. But it isn't intrinsically right, and it doesn't intrinsically give understanding. What you have to do in order to get understanding of morality is to use psychology, psychiatry, anthropology, and history to explore the roots of our current behavior.
I wonder, though, when it comes to the Bible, you know, Professor Coles from Harvard said that, I mean, all ethical standards that we get are simply footnotes to the Sermon on the Mount. I think when it comes to Judeo-Christian morals, even humanism has come from that. I mean, humanism really was in existence, though, even during the Renaissance and during times of the barbarians. And so it was simply this type of, I want to make myself better and perhaps the society around me better. But ultimately, it failed. And we see with the Humanist Manifesto, it's trying to make a comeback now. But if we lose, especially here in the West, Judeo-Christian values, we are in tremendous dire straits for the future. And
well, I have some sympathy with that on the grounds, you know, I'm imbued with Judeo-Christian attitudes because I've lived in that kind of society. And so, you know, I feel naturally comfortable with them. And for reasons that we've been touching on, they are in some sense, but not all of them, good. I think there are some Judeo-Christian principles which are probably not particularly good. But also, I don't think you should worry that about the evolution of understanding too much. It's a bit like science. Science emerged from religion, but we shouldn't blame religion necessarily. But science, we shouldn't blame science for having emerged from religion, I think is really what I want to say. It was a natural, cultural, intellectual progress. And the fact that our understanding of human behavior finds roots and suggestions of the basis in the Bible and so on shouldn't mean that humanism is erroneous. I mean, it's a part of the intellectual evolution of society.
I don't think that moral absolutes are based on God arbitrarily decreeing them. I think moral absolutes instead are based on the character of God, which is good. And if you take the character of God out of the equation, you're up a creek without a paddle when it comes to explaining why something is good, why something is evil. The reason something is evil is because it denigrates the intrinsic value of a human being. Well, where does a person get their value from? Certainly not from their culture, certainly not from their own arrogance. A person gets their value from the creator who created them for a purpose. Therefore, evil is denying the value of a person. Evil is denying the purpose for which God created us, to love and respect God, to love and respect each other. So when you take God out of the equation, the Judeo-Christian ethic falls apart, sir.
Well,
and I respect your use of the word intrinsic, but sir, if there is no God, there is nothing intrinsically evil. There is nothing intrinsically good. It just is, sir. What is, that's all. It's all just science. It's all just matter and energy. Now, when you and I create values like, well, this is good and that's evil, fine, no problem. We can do that. But we ought to have the humility and the honesty to acknowledge that those are arbitrary. Those are not intrinsic. They're not innate. They're not objective. They're not absolute. There are personal prejudices and biases. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. I think your opening few sentences, I think I would recast by replacing the word God in them by evolution. And then I think your position and my position would coincide. But to say that God is the fount of all goodness, I think it ignores the fact that he was, in the Old Testament, he's an evil entity who encourages death and destruction. It's only when you get to the retrospective creation of the New Testament and the creation of a kind of Jesus figure who embodies what we in the West regard as good, that you can begin to like the God that you suggest exists. But you have to exist. You have to accept that there's no evidence for there being a God. It's an entirely man-made construction built on anxiety, fear, and ignorance.
All right, you've made two fascinating points. First of all, the Old Testament. All the heroes of the Old Testament had a deep desire to know God better, even though they understood that God judged. When Abraham struggles with God over Sodom and Gomorrah, he's asking, will the judge of the whole of the earth do right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, all these great heroes of the faith, Hannah, Deborah, Sarah, they saw that God was so good that they wanted to get to know him better. And that's in the Old Testament. Enoch, the man who walked with God. Noah, who floated a boat and went through the flood. These people knew God, and yes, they understood judgment. But they still wanted to know God better because they knew that God was really good. And this whole judgment has really been twisted. Because, sir, you judge. I judge. We have to make judgment calls. You've talked about evil people. You've talked about evil Adolf Hitler. Sir, that's a judgment you made. I agree with your judgment. I would call Adolf Hitler evil. I would call a rapist evil. Sir, that is a judgment. And if God is the creator of the cosmos and he's good and he really loves us, he must judge evil, just the same way you and I judge evil.
Well, I've said so much there that I won't deal with it all in one gulp. It's not like eating a Chinese bun, which you have to nibble at. So let me nibble at various bits of what you said. I think the so-called heroes and their dialogue with God, seeking to understand, could be regarded simply as an allegory. They were struggling to think of what is the best way, the good way forward. It doesn't mean to say that the God actually exists. It was an allegory which enabled them to formulate their views and then move forward to take action. So, okay, struggle with a concept and then turn it into a kind of PR device that invokes something called a god, and you've got a good story to tell. Doesn't mean to say that the device actually exists. Another nibble at another edge of your bun. I mean, there is no evidence that there is a god that created the universe. Science doesn't need a god to create what there is. And certainly, I think that there is no evidence that there is a purpose in the universe. And I don't believe, and I use that term cautiously, I don't believe that an individual has a purpose either. An individual emerges from his or her mother's womb, and that's it. Just as the universe emerges in a way that science cannot yet understand or explain, but is working towards an explanation out of absolutely nothing without intervention. So there is no evidence for a God, but it's entirely understandable why people, angst-driven that they are, need a God to help them through the difficult problems of living a life. A God is a kind of handbook on gardening. Just to look at a garden and think of how to develop it is a very complicated business. And so you need handbooks. A God, well, life is much more complex than a simple exercise in gardening. And so you need you need more guidance. And some people call that God.
Well, when you read the Gospels, you see that God humbled himself, became a man, and then self-sacrificed. Christ lived a life of amazing integrity, not relative integrity, real integrity. He self-sacrificed, and he calls you and me to do that. And he claims that he's God, revealing himself in a way that you and I, with our finite minds, can begin to understand who God is, what God's character is like. And Jesus does not say, believe in God, believe in me, because you're scared to die. No, he says, look at the evidence. And that's what John points out in the Gospel of John. Look at these miracles that Christ performed. This is why you should believe. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, the reason you believe in Jesus is because he rose from the dead. He's not appealing to fear. He's not appealing to anxiety. He's appealing to look at the historical evidence that Christ rose from the dead. Based on the evidence, put your faith in him.
Well, there is no evidence for anything that you have just said. A miracle.
What's the evidence that the laws of nature are going to hold tomorrow?
That's not a miracle.
There's no evidence. There's no evidence. You can't prove to me scientifically, sir, that the laws of nature are going to hold tomorrow.
No, I'm not going to try to.
Right. Sir, there are many different types of knowledge. It doesn't mean that the laws of nature are not going to hold tomorrow just because we can't prove it. There's evidence based on history.
The laws of nature have existed in the past and have not been contravened.
Right.
I mean, there has never been anything that is that a reliable, a miracle has never occurred. Take David Hume's remark that it's always easier to disbelieve the reporter than it is to believe what he actually reported. So miracles are fantasies. even the physicians in the Vatican who have to verify that a miracle has occurred in order for a beatification and a canonization to occur are the incompetent doctors, and they don't understand the workings of the human body and its immune system. A miracle of any kind has never occurred. A resurrection.
You believe in the miracle that life comes from non-life. Sir, that is a miracle. You believe in the miracle that the rational comes from the non-rational. That is a miracle, sir. You believe in the miracle that consciousness comes from non-consciousness. Sir, that is a miracle. And you believe that morals come from matter and energy. That's a miracle. The problem is you don't have a miracle worker. You don't have a God. But you believe in miracles the same way I do.
No, I don't. I think you're misusing the word miracle. Life emerged from the inorganic in a manner that took place by a series of physical and chemical steps.
That's a miracle.
Yeah.
You can't duplicate that in a lab today, sir.
I understand now. I understand. You mean that anything that happens is a miracle?
No. I mean,
Yes.
if you can't scientifically show it, if you hold science as being
I just said
human knowledge, that's what knowledge is. You can't scientifically show me that life comes from non-life. It's impossible.
It would be a miracle if you would let me to say what I want to say. There's a miracle. Thank you. Life emerged from the inorganic world through a series of physical and chemical steps that were not directed purposefully, but simply took place and then were sealed into the physical ecosystem through the process of natural selection. We do not yet know the details of the individual chemical and physical step that took the inorganic into becoming the organic, but we are not empty of ideas. There are many ideas. We are not simply going to propose them without evidence, and that is why scientists are taking a long time in their sure-footed way to unravel the past and discover the steps by which life emerged. They do not need to invoke purpose. They do not need to invoke laws that we do not currently possess.
I like, Peter, that you started with this belief. You said belief, but you said it carefully. But then you also were honest about science coming from religion and evolving in that kind of way. You know, Kepler, Newton, even Galileo, you talk about some of the pioneers of science. They became scientific because they saw these laws, and so they invoked a lawgiver. And they said, let's chase it. We can make sense of these eventually, rather than the more linear cultures that became cyclical, like Islam, like Buddhists. There was no A to B to Z for those cultures. But scientifically, these Christian scientists who started science understood that there was a true lawgiver and that they could chart the course ultimately of this lawgiver. Sorry, Peter, just one more second here. I think, too, when it comes to the miraculous, your guys' discussion here is very interesting on the miraculous. I probably agree with parts of both. But for me, it's kind of, you can't even begin the discussion because Peter or an atheist couldn't even test for a miracle if it occurred. And what I mean by that, if I chopped off my arm and it began to grow back, you ultimately would not say that's a miracle, because miracles are based on a few different things. One of those is replicability, so you're not going to be able to replicate it. And then two, a natural cause. And there's clearly not a natural cause for my arm growing back. The vast majority of the world believes in miracles. The West has a much tougher time of it, but you look at near-death experiences and we're coming along in different types of ways. But then also in terms of when I hear you use belief, that word a couple times, I think you cannot prove that there is no God, obviously. So that is a belief. That's even potentially a miracle, because you cannot take God, put him in a test tube, and scientifically replicate or from a natural cause say God does not exist. So it takes understanding of belief from both sides, which is why I like that you use the word belief.
I think you can almost prove that God doesn't exist. Very difficult always to prove negative. And of course, God might be just pulling my strings at this very moment. Who knows? But first of all, you can ask whether there is any aspect of the universe that science potentially cannot explain. If there is, then that opens the door to the existence, the possible existence of God. But if there is no aspect of the universe that science cannot at least potentially explain, then there is no need for a God. Secondly, another prong for the dismissal of God thesis is that it is easy to understand why people are desperate for there to be a God. So there is a powerful drive towards believing in a God's existence, even in the absence of evidence. And that drive is personal anxiety about what happens after you're dead, anxiety, ignorance about the understanding the complexity of the world and looking for simple explanations. And God, frankly, is a simple explanation of aspects of the world that science finds it very difficult to explain, but is coming to explanations. So first of all, you don't need a God, because science can do everything that God was imported and invented to do. And secondly, you can understand why people are desperate for there to be a God. And as to all those scientists who believed in God, people like Newton and Faraday and so on, I mean, they just were at the early stages of the transition from religion into science. They were brought up in a cultural milieu where everyone believed in God, and it gradually led to the emergence of the modern world, where you don't need to believe in God.
But I would say, too, that atheists have a very similar drive not to believe. It's just on the other end of the spectrum. You could talk about Freudian wish fulfillment or Martin Luther's supposed death anxiety. But I would say, you chart the 100 most prolific atheists, perhaps in the last 200 years, Bertrand Russell and many others. And psychological studies show that they had fathers who were either absentee or who had died or who were abusive. And I think that translates over into perhaps not wanting a father figure, a spaghetti monster who has some type of stick over us. Obviously, the Christian God is not that type. And so much of me doesn't want there to be a God, because I want to live a very hedonistic lifestyle. I want to live a lifestyle where there's no quote unquote strings attached. I want to live a lifestyle where I don't have to make tremendous commitments. So I think I have more of a motivation to not believe in God than to believe in God emotionally.
Yeah, well, people are brought up in different ways. The power of cultural conditioning is quite extraordinary. If one's brought up in a Christian milieu, then it's very difficult not to be a Christian. It takes courage to discard the cultural conditioning that children are exposed to.
For me, it takes far more courage to bust out of my arrogance that basically loves to say, I am God. I am the one who creates right and wrong. I define the meaning and purpose of my life. I define why people are significant and why other people are not significant. To bust out of that human arrogance is incredibly difficult for me, and it demands great courage on my part to humble myself before God. But when I'm confronted by God bleeding and dying on a cross, self-sacrificing, I am confronted by a moral absolute of love that from my experience in life rings true. That, gosh, that is the purpose of life. But sir, if there is no God, there is no such thing as love. If there is no God, love is simply a chemical reaction. You might call it love, you might call it whatever you want to call it, but it's just a chemical reaction, which means if there is no God, when a man looks into the face of a woman and says, I love you, what he really means is, you sexually excite me. You turn me on. Therefore, I quote, love you. That's all there is to love. You're a bag of chemicals. I'm a bag of chemicals. If you reduce all of reality to matter and energy, my experience of life contradicts that. Science is a wonderful branch of knowledge, but so is history. So is personal relationship. You don't go on a scientific date. I don't go on a scientific date. When I met a student at MIT who said, I date my computer, that's tragic. We're not computers. We're not simple robots. The fact that I know myself shows I'm not a robot. A robot does not know that it is a robot. A human being has consciousness and knows I am not a robot. In other words, there's more to me than just a complex bag of chemicals. That's the way every atheist friend of mine lives their life. It's the way I live my life, which demands some type of mind outside of matter and energy, some type of eternal God, eternal being. That's not based on angst or fear of death. It's based on looking at reality and trying to find out, how do I live in harmony with reality?
Yeah, absolutely. But the rest of what you said was total nonsense, of course. You are a bag of chemicals. You are nothing more than a bag of chemicals. You are a bag of very intricately arranged chemicals. A person's behavior is sorry about that. Can you cut this from anything that goes up?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, my wife is not well.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. That we are just intricate bags of chemicals responding to the environment around us. Even love is a question of what is going on in our brains and in our endocrine systems. It's nothing beamed in from outside, or it really is a physiological response.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think of love, though, as the intangibles. I don't know if you've read the book Into Thin Air, and it's a famous Harvard psychologist who's dying of cancer, and he becomes a Christian because of all these intangibles. I think of, for me, when it comes to love, just looking at it as oxytocin and endorphins and serotonin flowing in such a way. No, there's something more. We want relationships to last eternally. Now, if I became an intense Buddhist, and if I was missing my family, there's one story of a woman who came to the US and she was a Buddhist, and she was asked, do you miss your family? She said, I'm working on that. And what she meant was, no, I cannot love, and I will not love. I need to have this healthy level of detachment, because I know love will not last ultimately. Now, I think that's cutting off part of our hearts. I don't think that that's buying into true reality. When we're sitting around a dinner table and we have all of our family members, looking at all of our family members' faces, knowing that we will never see them again, and each and every one of them will be completely stripped from this world, most likely in a very horrific way, is tremendously sad. And I have to cut off part of my heart if I think that that's truth. So living into the reality that this is not simply a brute matter of we need to change and we need to fix our wishful thinking and live into reality and not have these types of fears. I think it aligns way more so with meaning and purpose. And I think you're right to say that purpose, you can manufacture that here in the world, but I ultimately think that it's way more intellectually honest. It fits and jives with our emotions to connect with something transcendent. And obviously Viktor Frankl talked about that when he was in the prisoner of war camps. Those who did not become nasty, those who did not become suicidal, those who did not start teaming up with the Nazis were the ones who believed that there was some type of God outside of the camps, that they could have meaning and purpose found in that God. Or it's like David Foster Wallace, who said before he committed suicide, he said, if you want something here on earth that will not really eat you alive, well, then you're going to have to switch your idols here on earth and start to understand and locate that my ultimate meaning and purpose is in something transcendent. He didn't say the Judeo-Christian God, But he said emotionally, intellectually, rationally, it makes far more sense to have a meaning in life that's connected to God rather than something here on earth.
Well, if you want to live a lie, that's the way of doing it, I suppose. But it's, I suppose the analogy is that it's undeniable that religion has been a great inspiration for art, music, and so on. But that doesn't mean that it's true. It just means that the idea is deeply embedded in people's psyches. So by all means, enrich life by believing in certain things, but don't think that you're exposing the truth, the ultimate reality of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I have to stop there because we've had our 30 minutes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much,
Thank
Peter.
you so much, Peter.
It's fascinating talking to you. We love how you think, and you stretch the minds of atheists, agnostics, Christians, so many people. So we so appreciate you and all your gifts and talents. We will put the links again to his latest books at the bottom. And Peter, we so appreciate you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Peter.
Pleasure. I hope I've improved people's lives.
Absolutely. Certainly have.